and welcome back, or welcome to the first time to Bible 365 with Kathy Carter, which is me. And Bible 365 means we're going through the Bible in 365 days, 1 year. So today we're on day 67, which puts us in the middle of Numbers. So we are at Numbers 25 and 26. And most of my time today is going to be spent in the first chapter. So we're going to get a little bit to the second chapter and some of the censor taking and things like that. But most of it is going to be in the first. So background is, well, first of all, using the 1 year chronological Bible reading plan, which you can find online for free. You can download it, print it. You can look it up every day if you want to. But a printable is nice and easy. So you can follow along with the reading. And I'm doing it in chronological order. So there is just a better understanding of who God is historically. So a reading through the Bible is amazing. I feel like you can understand it more when you read it through chronologically, so historically, so we know the areas and the dates and the times sort of in which things happened. And I think it gives you a better understanding of how God created um, his people, why he created the people the way in which he did, the people and the system, and then how that drew Jesus down, right? So what does that mean to me or to you as a listener, for someone who follows Christ, if you do follow Christ, or for someone who doesn't and just is trying to get an understanding of what all of this means? Maybe you're looking, maybe you're interested, or maybe even you're trying to disprove it. But reading through it chronologically, I think, helps with a historical understanding of the way God works. And I think when we start to understand more the way God works, I feel like it is easier for our hearts to fall more in love with him, to be drawn to him, because we have a better understanding. We don't just see him as a God who destroys, or as a mean God, or even separating the two. Like, quite often we tend to separate this Old Testament God with this New Testament God. There's even this uh, new whole campaign out there that really essentially just focuses on a lot of the niceties of Jesus, and which is all amazing. And I love the idea of drawing people to the love of Jesus, because there's many reasons people don't know who Jesus is. And one of them is that they think he's cruel and harsh and hateful, because it seems to be that they think Christian people are that way. So that's amazing. However, that's not the whole of Jesus. And so in order to get the whole picture of who he is, I think we need to read through the entire book, and just to get a greater understanding of that. So that's sort of a little bit of my preface, and that's why I do what I do, and why I'm hoping that other people will read it and be inspired to, or listen and watch and be inspired to read their Bibles. So now we are in the book of Numbers, and this is going to be really short this morning on my background. So we are still with Moses. Aaron has died at this point. Aaron is one of the priests of the Levitical tribe, and he has died, and now his son has taken over. They are wandering in the wilderness. They're in their who knows what year, but there's like this 40-year gap where they are. This one generation is dying out before this next generation can come in and come back to the land of milk and honey, because God already tried to give it to them, and they essentially turned it down because they were afraid they were going to lose, because it was a fortified city with really big people. So right now we are just sort of, I'm going to call it like the adventures of the Israelites, because that's sort of where we are. We're getting a picture of how they behaved in the 40 years, what they did, how people reacted to them, right? What the area looked like in this time. And so we're sort of getting a taste and a glimpse of what that 40 years looked like. So today, yesterday, we met Balak, Balaam, and the donkey, which you kind of can't forget the talking donkey story. And they tried to curse these people. So what we're seeing is that God's hand is heavy on these people. He is considering them a people that are set apart. And it is not, I want to be very, very, very clear, it is not because they are a perfect people. It is not because they are even a good people. They're not extraordinarily nicer than anybody else. They're not more prone to listen or follow rules than any other people group is. It is because God chose them to show the world who he was. So there were other people who worshiped him. And yesterday I talked about that a little bit, because we could see that Balak and Balaam were people who followed God. Now it looks like when we read today, he wasn't the only God that they followed. They followed many gods, and he was just one of the gods that they understood to exist and to believe in. But they followed multiple, and so we're going to see some of that here. So these people, the Israelites, were people that God was he had a covenant with them, and he was making an impact in the world because of them. And the whole idea was to have those people point back to him. So it was never, and it will never be about the people. It is always and will always and forever be about God. And so I think that's something that we need to be reminded of in our faith as well as other people who see us, right? So when we're trying to answer for the niceness of Christianity, or for, how certain people behave that call themselves Christians, and I'm one of those people. I remember before I was a believer, I certainly was like, well, they call themselves, a Christian, and they're judging, or they're not nice, or they're sleeping around, or right. So they're doing all of these things. Now, of course, the ultimate goal is we want to be following Christ as closely as possible, so our outward appearance matches our inward, right? So I don't want to take any of that away, that the outward is supposed to match the inward, but the reality is the outward matching the inward is to point everybody to Christ, right? So everyone can believe and understand that he is the one true God. He is the one to follow. He is the one that's bringing perfection back in this world. um, but we're not going to do it perfectly, and we're not going to do it the way that the world thinks that we should do it, because we actually aren't of the world, and the Israelites are showing that in this specific instance. They are not people of the land. So everybody in the area exists in one way, and the Israelites are sort of set apart. They exist outside of that. They're different from the rest of the world. So they're all doing these things. And God says, no, I want you to do my things and my things alone. Right. And in this, I know I've said this before, this is also why everyone would say, those of us, again, those people who don't necessarily understand the full gospel, the full understanding of our faith, would say, why aren't you following all these rules? They would open up the Old Testament. Why aren't you following all these rules? It's because it's not really for us as Christians. It was for the Israelites to be a set apart people in their time, right? And then, of course, through that, Jesus comes to bless the entire earth. Okay, so just kind of a little bit of a grasp of who the Israelites are, because they're going to screw up again. And that's why I want to make it clear that we see them screwing up, and we see how God responds to them. And I think that's a warning to us who believe and who follow Christ. And it's also an understanding for anyone outside of the faith at the time, who reads this, to understand that they were not a perfect people. And therefore, we are all collectively not a perfect people, and we're not going to do everything right all the time, to where the world goes, oh my gosh, the most amazing people in the world are Christians. Why couldn't we see that in the first place? Now I'm going to be a Christian. That's just not the way the world works. We wish it did, and it would be great. And there are definitely some people that come through that way, but that's not always the case. So we can't sort of try and fit that square peg into that circle hole. Okay, so starting in with the reading, that was a lot of background today, but starting into the reading, we are in Numbers 25, and it's just starting with that first verse is, while Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women. These are women, remember, they were kind of right outside the area of Moab. This is where Balak was. Balak was and is the king of Moab, and he was trying to curse them. They're living sort of in this outward area right outside of Moab and Midian. And so at this point, they're starting to, and so they're here a while, right? They've sort of set up camp, so to speak, in this area. If you remember, God says they took possession of the land. And so they're living in this area. And at this point now, they're starting to, they're no longer set apart as they should be, right? Because they still should be, even though they're planted and they're living in a land for a time. They're now starting to enmesh themselves with Moabite people. And now others would say, well, that's great. They should be all mixed up. And that's good. We want that, right? That's not true then. They needed to remain a clean and holy people, set apart from those who worshiped other gods, right? God wanted these people to be set apart. This was not about coming together. This wasn't meeting of the minds. This wasn't anything like that. This was about staying separate and holy. And so we see that over time they were enmeshing themselves. And not only that, it's not just like they were doing business with him. They were engaged in sexual immorality, which involved making sacrifices to a different God. So now we're involving sexual immorality, which God said over and over and over again. He set this whole list of standards in which he wanted the people to behave in that way. And then on top of that, they're then sacrificing to a different God. Now, I'm going to read verse 4. So verse 4 says, the Lord said to Moses, so they're sacrificing, and it says, verse 3, it says, Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. So it's an area, and the Baal is sort of like a different god, right? Because we see that in other areas. They use that as a term. And then the Lord got angry. I want to focus a little bit on this anger. So the Lord gets angry, and in verse 4, he says, the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. Sensitivity wise, we're coming into a generation where we don't want any type of death and destruction. And I say that as if it's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. Like, peace and love and unity, of course, is a utopian future we would all love to have. I don't believe that's a reality on this earth until Jesus comes back, because I can see we have large disagreements. We have disagreements on small scales with our actual neighbors, with our family members. There's people who don't speak to family. There's all kinds of um, tearing apart of people. And in big ways, it's essentially the same thing. It is very hard to live in unity with other people. And a lot of times, so-called good is asked to live in unity with so-called evil, and that's a really hard thing to do. I know I did a video a time back on what is good and what is evil, and how do you know? Don't we want to know the truth, right? Aren't we in a generation, and I'm sure all generations are like this, but where we are in a constant a constant search for what is actually true, and we're manipulated all the time into believing what other people believe. Search for truth on your own. Try and figure out through the reading of scripture and other things what is actually true, and then how can you know that it's true, right? So I know this is one of the things that we look for. So in this time, and in this time with Israel, we look at a punishment like that as harsh. She's saying kill all the leaders. Now I want to bring up a couple things. One, this couldn't have happened in days, right? They couldn't have, their tent came, they went to, remember those people came out against them in war, and then they wound up winning the battle, and they wound up taking possession of the land. So now they own the land, and they're sort of neighbors to Midianites and Moabites. And at this point, it couldn't have been like, we've been here for a week, and now we're cavorting with all the locals and having relationships with them. It has to be over some amount of time, right? Whether it be a year, 2 years, 3 years, we're not 100% sure. But what we do know, what we can, I think, contextually figure out is there has to be an amount of time that they've been here in order for them to get so enmeshed with the communities around them. So I'm going to say God is extremely patient, because God told them that they needed to behave a certain way, and they are not, right? So one day, 2 days, 3 days, it's now at the point where they're sacrificing to other gods. It has been a significant period of time. God has been very, very patient with them, right? Then he's like, it's too far. It's enough is enough. He sees what's happening. They're not repenting, they're not turning back, right? We don't see any of that in here. We don't see anywhere they're like, oh, you know what, that was a mistake and we need to start wrangling ourselves back in, right? We don't see any of that. We see them consistently just worshiping and being with this other people group that worships other gods. And so now, unfortunately, it's time for a punishment. And the punishment is, and this is a big sort of reason I wanted to read this verse, was again in verse 4, take all the leaders of all these people, kill them and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that, right? Remember, I kind of beat this dead horse a little bit, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. So now there has to be a consequence because Israel, so it wasn't just a couple of people, it's now the entire nation. Now, of course, it's not every single person, right? But there's a judgment of the nation as a whole. Israel has now turned away from the one true God. Not that they're not worshiping him. I'm sure they are, but they're also worshiping and sacrificing to other gods. So Israel, as a people group who are supposed to be wholly and completely focusing on the Lord, have turned their attention from this, right? And now they're wandering. So they're looking at other gods, they're sacrificing, they're doing immoral things, they're separating themselves from the one true God, right? By making themselves completely unclean by having relationships with people that worship different gods. So this is all, remember, we did this whole standard in the book of Leviticus and sort of in the beginning of the book of Numbers, where there were standards and guidelines that God set. They are turning away from them. Now, we might say, so what? It's not fair. Just tell them to turn back. There is this, because this is sort of my second point, is God was really patient. And then there has to be a consequence for our sin. And I know that we don't want it. I know it feels unfair. Well, just tell me that I'm doing wrong. We don't always listen to that. And I'm going to bring up a personal story because it's really fresh. My husband and I got into a fight, which happens. You're married, and I've been married 23 years, so there's just a reality that you're not always going to get along. Everything's not going to be cheery and wonderful and amazing all the time. But you're sitting in a fight and you're not speaking. So you've gotten in your fight, you've gotten in your argument, or maybe one side had the argument, one side was just listening, whatever it might be. And then you get to this point where you're just not speaking, right? And I have to tell you, there's a little bit of comfort there because with not speaking, there's no consequences to my actions, right? Maybe a little bit of a cold shoulder, but nothing major, right? Like I'm not getting emotional about anything. I'm not being pulled in any direction. I'm not being asked to change, right? Because there's just silence. So I can, in my heart, start to really pray and focus on, why is there silence and what do I need to do to change my ways? And listen, there are times where I can do that. I have done that before and I've gone, wow, I really messed this one up. And I need to go and I need to fall face down, whether it be literal, which is probably not literal, or metaphorical, and say, I was wrong in this situation. Please forgive me for what I did. These are the 3 things that I did, and I'm going to try and work on that and not do them again. Unfortunately, humans being what humans are, I don't always see my part that I played, right? There are some times where I'm like, I wasn't wrong. So I'm just going to sit out here and I'm going to eat my breakfast or eat my lunch or read my book and no one's going to bother me. And then I'm just going to go about my day regular. Eventually, things being normal, that explodes and there's a consequence. There's a fallout because not only now has the fight been what the fight was, but now this extra time has sort of built up. Instead of dealing with the situation as it is, now there's now hurt and there are walls put up and there's separation between a husband and wife, right? Because now there's a day, 2 days, 3 days, I don't know, some people could go months, right? Where there's a separation between the two of you. You haven't spoken, you haven't fought, but you haven't spoken either. So there's just this separation that builds between the two of you, or there's just politeness, right? So you go about your day and you say polite things, but you're not really connecting with your spouse on any kind of levels. So space now comes between you. And then there's just an explosion. And then consequences come, right? And I say this because I feel that our hearts are such that unless some kind of consequence comes from the action, we can just go about our day and pretend that we didn't do anything wrong. And how we have this expectation that that's fine that we behave like that, right? So if I want to explode on a person that hurts me and I want to make them pay for it and I want them to have a consequence for it, that's fine because they hurt me. But if I hurt a holy God, God shouldn't have any consequences for us for hurting him. Or his consequences are deemed unfair. I'm going to say the only person on this planet that is fair is the God of the universe, right? I want to punish in a way that I want to punish, right? So I might want to go extra that day, right? Depending on my mood, depending on how bad I've been hurt, or depending how far our separation was, right? So I want to punish even further, or my spouse wants to punish me even more because now he feels doubly hurt because not only did I hurt him, but then I ignored him for 4 days after that, right? Or whatever. So there is a punishment and a consequence to our actions. The issue is that it feels really bad to see those punishments on paper. I look at this and I go, he killed all these leaders for sleeping with somebody else. Now, in my mind, I feel like I can logically wrap around it, but I know I've probably read it 6 or 7 times, right? And I'm sure the first time I was like, this is a horrible, vindictive God, right? So it has taken me a lot of times to sort of refresh what I believe and understand is true about God and myself, of course, to recognize that his patience is actually the key. The fact that he didn't knock them down, the fact that he didn't kill them immediately when they started sleeping with the enemy, so to speak, shows how patient he is with us, because he said, don't do this. And he said, if you do this, you are going to be cut off from your people, right? If you do this, you are going to be killed. And they did it and they were not killed. And they did it again and they were not killed. And they did it again and they were not killed. And finally he said, that's it, right? Now I need to turn. Now all these leaders and all these people are starting to turn my people collectively away from me. That is not good for them. And so I am going to destroy those who are sort of in power, because what he does is he's actually destroying the leaders. It doesn't really say that he's destroying like the heads of the clans and things like that. It doesn't actually say that he's destroying any of the what we would call regular people. He's destroying the leaders, the people in charge, because remember, they're responsible. And so he's taking the lives of those people so that the rest of the people turn back towards him, so they remember that he is a holy God who has just punishments and who is ultimately more patient with us than we deserve. And so then after he does that, and then they start calling it a plague. And so I'm wondering if a plague came on them or if they went out of their way and killed them without a plague. I'm not really sure which version of that is, because he uses the term, he says to kill them, and then he uses the term plague. And so I'm not sure if the plague is just that so many people died until they turned away from their sin, or if it was a literal plague that killed the people. But one of the things that we see is that even after all this, and we're still sort of early in the chapter, even after he does all this, one of the people just blatantly in front of Moses brings his Midianite woman into camp, and he goes into his house and he starts having relations with her. And then Phineas, who is the son of Eleazar, who was the son of Aaron. So Aaron has died. Aaron was the first priest, excuse me. And then we had Eleazar, his son, and now this is his son's son. So he is in the line of the priesthood, and so the one that will actually be speaking to God going into the tabernacle with the Ark of the Covenant. So he goes and he is a zealous person, which means he loves the Lord zealously. So we could probably see that on people when they love the Lord zealously. And he goes in with a spear and he kills both the man and the woman. And then, because he's looked at as a hero later, which actually is true. What he does is because he does this, and because he is so zealous for the Lord stops the plague that has been happening to the leaders because of all that they have been doing, right? So his zealousness and his excitedness for the Lord and taking this essentially in his own hands and handling the evil that is happening inside his camp, right in front of him. It says right in front of the tent of meeting while people were mourning, he brought this woman in. So how blatantly he did this to God. And Phineas was offended for God. And so he took the situation in his own hands. God saved the rest of the people. But then we see that 24,000 people actually died. So this was a lot of people that died. So moving on to, I'm just going to read verse 14. It says, the name of the Israelite who was killed with a Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a Simeonite family. So this guy was a leader, and this guy was breaking the covenant with God by doing all the things that he was doing. So he was turning away from God, and he was a leader of his people. So if the leader's doing it, what does that say for the rest of the people? Everything's fine. We can do it. Our leader's doing it, right? Leaders, we, because I'm doing this, we need to be careful, right? In the way in which that we treat the Lord, in the way other people see that, so that how that reflects off of us. All right, and then the name of the Midianite woman who was put to death was Cosby, daughter of Zur, a tribal chief of a Midianite family. So then it says, the Lord said to Moses, treat the Midianites as enemies and kill them. They treated you as enemies when they deceived you in Peor, the incident involving their sister and the daughter of a Midianite leader. So now there's sort of now they need to kill the Midianite people because of all the situation, because those people were actively turning the Israelites away from the one true God, and God wants to turn their hearts back. And so they need to kind of flush this evil out in the area. So God has given them the okay to kill the people. So moving on to the next chapter. Now, I don't have a huge amount in this because we start taking a census. So after the plague, the Lord said to Moses and Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, take a census of the whole Israelite community by families, all those 20 years or older. So remember, we did this before. And it looks like the reason he's doing it again is one, because obviously they lost people, but two, because they're sort of now heading towards going back to the land of milk and honey. So it looks like most of the other generation was killed off. And so they're doing a brand new census for each tribe to see how many people were in each tribe and then what they'd be essentially bringing back to the land of Canaan. And so just a couple of things that I noted in here. Some of them were just very regular, right? But some of the things that he did is he reminded us of Old Testament things, right? So if we go to the tribe of Reuben, so it says, well, actually, this tribe of Reuben, it says in verse 8, the son of Pelu and Eliab, and the sons of Eliab were Nemuel, Dathan, and Abiram. The same, so here he goes reminding us of the story. The same Dathan and Abiram were the community officials who rebelled against Moses and Aaron. Remember, the ground swallowed them up. And so he's just reminding them of that story. And then we see descendants of Simeon, and then we see the tribe of Gad. So these are all just regular sort of, they're talking about each tribal head, the children. And then in the tribe of Judah, one of the things that I noted was in verse 21, we have the descendants of Perez. So first of all, and Onan were the son of Judah. So this is going back to Genesis, if you guys remember, if you read with me in Genesis. They died in Canaan. So Tamar came in, was married to first, and was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord killed him. This was Judah's first son. And then Onan wouldn't leave his seed in her because he didn't want her to have a son in the name of And then so the Lord killed him as well. And then she wound up having a baby with Judah. And so that baby with Judah is noted in here. There's a special note for him, which is in verse 21, the descendants of Perez. So now we get to see Perez's descendants as well as Judah's descendants. So that's a note going back to Genesis. Another one that is an interesting note, which we don't see yet, but we may eventually see in the tribe of Manasseh. First is the reminder that these are Joseph's sons. So Joseph, remember, doesn't have a tribe, but his two sons do. They were adopted by Jacob. And another thing in this, and just I've noted it a couple times, but this is actually, for me, this is a reminder when he's going back to the Old Testament. I feel like, one, this is why he wrote Genesis. So we have a feeling that Moses wrote Genesis. It's probably the most likely story is that Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So it's most likely that he was mostly the author. I know he does eventually die, but he's mostly the author of those books. And it seems like he wrote the book of Genesis to let the people know the truth about where they came from, and to then remind them, because all of these things get brought up. Who are you? Where did you come from? And then he goes back to Genesis and he lets them know where they came from. So again, this sort of, to me, it's building those foundations of the truth of Genesis. And I know that's a hard one because I know a lot of people don't, because it's so out there, they want to think that it's just metaphors for the way that we live our lives. I think because of the way he goes back that it's not, but of course I'm holding that lightly in my hands. but I do appreciate that he keeps going back and sort of reminding us of the things that happened. So anyway, so then he goes to the tribe of Manasseh, again, who is Joseph's son. And in verse 33, he brings up this guy, Zelophehad, who had no sons and only daughters. And so it's just an interesting note that we're talking about all girls, because what does that mean? Usually we see that this is everything is passed down. The people who are being counted in the census are men. And so do these women get counted? Don't they get counted? I mean, their names are all noted in here. So if there are no men in the tribe, then, or no men sort of in that bloodline of Zelophehad, what does that mean, right, for the tribe? Does it go extinct, or do these women sort of step up and have some kind of take in that? Um, and then, so then I just want to go to that final verse, which is in verse 51. The total number of men in Israel was 601,000. So it's around the same as what it was 40 years ago. So it looks like they're repopulating and regenerating the sort of the same amount of those who died. And then we move on to verse 52. The Lord said to Moses, the land is to be allotted to them as an inheritance based on the number of names. To the larger group, give a larger inheritance, and smaller group, give a smaller one, receiving their inheritance by lot. So it's being distributed by lot. And I think we go into this further, but just a very small, doing things by lot is through the Lord. And the priest wear that breastplate that has those two sort of dice on them, the Uman and Thummim. I think that's the way we pronounce them. And you would pray something to the Lord, ask that, and then you would roll the dice, and the lot is blessed by the Lord, is chosen by the Lord. And so everyone who gets their lot, like obviously the bigger get the bigger land, and it's chosen by lot. And so by lot, it would be given to each person. And so that would be God's choice of what they are giving them. It's not by chance. It's not distributing in a way that we would deem fair, but it's distributed in the way that the Lord chooses to distribute the land to the people. And then, of course, the Levites do not get any land. And then they go over all the Levites in the tribe, and they make 23,000. So verse 63, it says, these are the ones counted by Moses and Eleazar the priest when they counted the Israelites on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from the Jericho. Not one of them was among those counted by Moses and Aaron the priest when they counted the Israelites at the desert of Sinai. So again, we're coming to that. Remember, we're coming to that area where all that generation has died off. It says, except for Caleb and Joshua, excuse me, not Joseph. Caleb and Joshua. So they're the only two that are left, essentially, of course, in Moses. They're the only three left from the original group of men from the ages of 20 to 60 that went into the land and said that they were whining and complaining. So all of those have died off at this point. And then I have a feeling we're going to start trekking back towards Canaan, the land of milk and honey, to see what God does with his people there. That is all for today. We're done. And if you like this, if this was a blessing to you, I want you to like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, comment. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say, what your readings, what they meant to you, what they brought up in you, and share it with the rest of us. So I want you to keep reading, and I'll see you tomorrow.